The best fighter of the Second World War was never supposed to exist. It was not conceived as a masterpiece. It was ordered as someone else's copy, cheap, nameless, second-rate. The firm entrusted with this machine had never, in its entire history, built a single combat fighter, not one. And yet, it was this firm that lifted a legend into the sky. But first, failure. A brilliant airframe hauled an unsuitable heart for nearly 2 years. The machine was kept low to the ground, driven into reconnaissance, very nearly scrapped. And then, one single swap turned everything upside down, and the aircraft nobody wanted became the one everybody feared. This comes down to one of the most uncomfortable stories in all of world aviation. The story of how two great powers spent nearly 2 years failing to see what weapon they held in their hands. Of an audacious refusal that was later quietly struck from the parade ground chronicles. Of a legend born against every calculation, every budget, and all common sense. Who truly gave this machine its deadly power? Why is its title as the best still disputed to this day? And which detail of this story do they prefer to keep off the front pages of the textbooks? Watch to the end, and you will see how a doubtful copy of someone else's aircraft turned into the undisputed king of the sky, and the price that Crown demanded. The story of the finest fighter of the Second World War does not begin in the sky. It begins in a cramped office, behind closed doors, in January of 1940. And it begins with a deal whose real nature people preferred to keep quiet. The war is on. Over Europe hangs a deceptive calm, but the British are already counting every aircraft they have, and the count terrifies them. Fighters are catastrophically scarce. The factories at home cannot keep pace. And so London turns its eyes across the ocean, to a place where men still work calmly and well-fed. In those very weeks, the executives of the American firm North American are summoned before the British Purchasing Commission, a firm that had never, you hear that, never, built a combat fighter. It churned out trainers, the NA-16 series, and nothing more serious than that. And these are the men called into the room where the fate of the air war is being decided. What are they offered? The chance to create something great? No. They are asked for one thing only: to become someone else's hands. The British Commission lays it out plainly. Set up licensed production of the Curtiss P-40, the fighter already nicknamed the Tomahawk on the Foggy Isle. Copy it, stamp it out. Don't get clever. This is what it all comes down to, the dirtiest truth of that meeting. American engineering talent was handed the role of a silent machine tool, not a creator, a copyist. Take another man's blueprint and run it down the assembly line by the thousand. And here arises the first uncomfortable question, the one sidestepped for decades. Why did the machine later crowned the best piston engine fighter on the planet almost come into the world as a mere copy of someone else's far from perfect design? Why did the fate of a legend hang by a thread before a single sketch had even been drawn? The answer hides in one single detail, and that detail changes everything. By then, Curtiss had simply choked. Its plants were working for the United States Army at the very limit of their capacity. Not an ounce of free output remained, and it could not physically deliver a single spare Tomahawk to the Allies. This is what the whole scheme had run into: a dead end, a warring empire, without enough fighters, the main supplier, without a single free machine, and a middleman called in for one purpose only: to obediently reproduce another man's aircraft on an American line. The odds looked hopeless, and it is precisely out of that hopelessness that one of the boldest turns in the history of world aviation is about to be born. And here the story took an entirely different turn, the very moment that would later be carefully smoothed over in dry official summaries. Picture the scene. On one side of the table, the British Purchasing Commission, men with a burning Europe at their backs and a desperate shortage of combat machines. They came for a simple solution: They needed a copy. They needed an assembly line. They needed tomahawks, many of them, and fast. On the other side, the Americans, summoned in the role of mere executors, a firm without a single combat fighter to its name, an outfit whose ceiling, until that very day, had been school desks with wings, and all that was expected of them was an obedient nod. They did not nod. This is what it all comes down to, the boldest move in the entire story. The head of North American did not snap to attention. He did not swear he would faithfully copy out another man's blueprints. He did the one thing nobody in that room expected. He proposed that the British throw out the licensing idea altogether and let him build them an entirely new fighter, their own, from scratch, to his own original design. Take in the sheer audacity of that offer. A firm that had never lifted a combat aircraft into the sky declares to a warring empire, "Do not trust us with a copy. Trust us with a legend that does not yet exist, even on paper." And here arises the question all the parade ground chronicles step around. What were these men counting on? Where does an outfit that stamped out trainers find such confidence? What did they know that no one else did? The stakes were monstrous. Think about it. The most terrible war in history is raging. The sky over Europe is on the line. And instead of the proven, if imperfect, tomahawk, the Americans are offering emptiness, a promise, an aircraft that exists neither in metal nor in the air. Any sober official would have thrown such a proposal out within the first minute. Too risky, too brazen, too much like the bluff of an outfit with nothing to lose. But what happened next defies all ordinary logic. The British Purchasing Commission, those same hardened men with a burning Europe behind them, approved that risky idea. They said yes to a firm without a single fighter in its biography. They wagered the fate of part of their air force on a project that existed only in the heads of American engineers. This is the fork in the road after which there was no turning back. One stroke of the pen, and instead of a safe copy of another man's machine, something fundamentally new begins to come into the world. Why did they agree? What drove these war-hardened Britons to take such a gamble? Was it the cold calculation of the desperate? Or did someone in that room glimpse in the brazen Americans what no one else could see? The official version modestly stays silent on the details of that deal. And yet it was in this very moment, in a cramped office of 1940, quietly and almost casually, that the fate of a future legend was being decided. The decision was made. The wheel began to turn. And now these brazen newcomers would have to prove, in metal and in iron, that their insane wager had been worth something. And let us be honest about what that yes truly meant. It was not a contract for a known quantity. It was a leap into the dark, signed by men who could not afford a single mistake. Every nodding bureaucrat in that room was, in effect, staking lives. The lives of the pilots who would one day climb into a machine that, on that winter day, did not have so much as a name. No proven prototype, no combat record, no reputation to lean on. Nothing but the word of an American firm and the steel nerve of its leadership. That was the entire collateral, and on that collateral an empire at war chose to bet. So ask yourself the question the textbooks bury. Was this the reckless act of cornered men, or did someone, somewhere, already understand that the so-called copyists were about to rewrite the rules of the air entirely? And so, the brazen promise was committed to paper. By May of 1940, the contract was signed. With that signature, the fine words ended, and the hard, measurable obligations began. The numbers of this deal deserve to be spoken aloud. 320 fighters. That is how many new, not yet existing machines the firm pledged to deliver to the Royal Air Force, a firm that did not have a single combat aircraft to its name, not a dozen for trial, not a small batch to look over, straight away, 320. This is what the whole gamble came down to. The British were not ordering a prototype. They were ordering an entire airborne fist from newcomers who had yet to prove a single thing. But a contract is not only quantity, it is conditions. And here is where it gets truly interesting. The aircraft was required to possess good maneuvering characteristics, not acceptable ones, not tolerable ones, good ones, in the thick of war, against the enemy's finest machines. And that demand was written into the document in advance, before the new fighter had ever left the ground. And now, the price. The cost of a single machine was not to exceed $40,000, and that figure is deceptively simple. Behind it hides the real pressure placed on the designers. Think about it. A new generation combat fighter for $40,000. By wartime standards, for a machine of that class, it was a more than acceptable sum, suspiciously modest even. The British wanted everything at once: novelty, maneuverability, mass production, and all of it cheap. This is the trap North American had set for itself: promise a revolution, and fit it into a miserly budget. Build the best in the world, and do it without ruining the customer. And the harshest condition hid not in the money, but in time. War does not wait. Every month of delay meant the enemy's dominance of the sky. The Americans were asked for the impossible: to roll out a finished prototype within monstrously compressed deadlines, measured not in years, but in mere weeks. At the customer's demand, about 120 days. 120 days to conjure a combat fighter out of nothing. Any engineer will tell you, this is beyond reason. A full combat machine is not built that way. Drawings, calculations, wind tunnel tests, assembly, trials, these take years, and here, weeks. And again, the uncomfortable question arises. Why would a firm with no experience put its name to such crushing terms at all? 320 machines, a hard ceiling on price, a high bar for maneuverability, and an almost impossible deadline. Any sensible businessman would have fled from such a contract. The machine's future designation, NA-73, had yet to be born, and the obligations already hung over the designers like a sentence. The signature was set. The conditions were spoken. There was nowhere left to retreat, and this entire mountain of figures, deadlines, and demands rested on one single assumption: on the belief that a handful of men who had never built fighters would manage to do what almost no one secretly expected of them. Let us linger on those 40,000 for a moment longer. A sum like that buys you a copy, a reliable, unremarkable, already tested machine. It does not buy you a revolution, and yet a revolution is exactly what was promised under that same ceiling. So where was the catch? How does an outfit with no track record swear to deliver hundreds of fighters of a brand new design that maneuver better than the enemy's best on a shoestring budget in a matter of weeks? Either these men were lying, or they understood something about modern aircraft that the established giants had missed entirely. 320 machines on paper, a price held down by an iron clamp, a standard of maneuverability set sky high, and a clock ticking down from 120 days. Read those terms together, in one breath, and they sound less like a contract, and more like a dare. This is what makes the whole affair so suspicious in hindsight. Nobody signs obligations like these unless they already know, deep down, that they can be met. The confidence of North American was not the bravado of fools. It was the calm of men who had glimpsed a solution no one else was looking at. And that is precisely why the official chronicles prefer to skip lightly over this contract, because the terms themselves whisper an uncomfortable truth. The so-called copyists were never planning to copy anything at all, and the impossible happened. On the 26th of October, 1940, the new aircraft lifted off the ground for the first time. The prototype, given the factory designation NA-73, rose into the sky, almost exactly within those monstrous deadlines that only recently had seemed like pure madness. Take that in once more. An outfit that had never built fighters rolled out a finished combat machine in a matter of weeks. What took the world's great manufacturers years, the newcomers pulled off almost effortlessly. And this is the first inconsistency the parade ground chronicles tiptoe past. How? By what means? Where did yesterday's makers of school desks with wings find a solution that turned aerodynamics on its head? This comes down to one detail that was kept out of the spotlight for a long time: the laminar flow wing, a special profile calculated so that the air would slide over it with the least possible resistance. A cold, clean piece of engineering cunning that squeezed out extra speed from almost nothing. Not horsepower, not brute force, geometry, calculation, shape, and it is precisely this detail that changes everything. While the others piled on bigger engines, the Americans rewrote the very surface over which the aircraft glides, and in that lay the trump card the seasoned competitors had failed to see. The prototype flew, the figures held up, and the British did the one thing that speaks louder than any words. They increased the order, from 320 machines to 620, nearly double, with a single stroke of the pen. Remember that gesture. A warring empire doubles its bet on the aircraft of a firm that, only yesterday, had not a single fighter behind it. That is not how you treat a doubtful machine. That is how you act only when you sense something exceptional in your hands. This comes down to the moment when the gamble turned, once and for all, into certainty. Alongside the testing of the prototype, the factories of North American were already spinning up serial production, without waiting for the final verdicts. Ahead of the curve, the war dictated the pace, and the pace was held. And so, in April of 1941, the first production fighter rose into the sky, with that same laminar flow wing, no longer a one-off prototype, but a machine off the assembly line, ready to enter service. The British gave it a name, resonant, predatory, searing itself into memory: Mustang. And here, pay attention. Here, you must slam on the brakes, because this, the first Mustang, is not yet that Mustang. Not the legend the whole warring world would speak of a few years later, not the machine that would make enemy pilots tremble, not the predator whose very name would become a synonym for supremacy in the sky. What stands before us is, for now, only a draft of the legend, a rough sketch, the shadow of a future champion. And herein lies the most treacherous turn of the entire story. The aircraft already bears a great name, yet it does not yet possess great power. It is handsome, it is fast down low, it is well-shaped, but hidden within it lurks a flaw that would very soon crawl into the open and nearly bury the whole reputation of the project. So what was that flaw? What kept an almost finished legend from becoming itself? And why was the machine that would be called the best almost written off at the start? The answer was not hidden in the wing, nor in the blueprints. It was droning up front, under the cowling, in the very heart of this machine. But one thing, by this moment, was already beyond dispute. The potential foundation, the bedrock of a future triumph, was already in North Americans' hands. An airframe born of audacity, a wing ahead of its era, a name destined to thunder. Everything was ready. Only one thing was missing: the very spark that would turn a rough draft into a masterpiece. And consider how rarely the textbooks pause on this contradiction. A fighter is celebrated for its speed, its grace, its laminar wing, and in the same breath, quietly, it is admitted that this early Mustang could not climb, could not breathe, could not fight where it mattered most. High above the earth, where the great air battles were decided, the machine simply ran out of strength. That is the dirty secret of the first Mustang. Magnificent at low level, helpless at altitude, a predator with clipped wings the moment it tried to reach the heights. So the picture splits in two. On the surface, a triumph. A prototype delivered in record time, an order nearly doubled, a name that already sounded like victory. Beneath the surface, a machine quietly choking the higher it climbed, carrying a weakness no amount of polished metal could disguise. Why does this matter? Because the legend we have been promised was not born in that October of 1940. It was only conceived. The airframe was right. The wing was right. The name was right. And yet the thing under the cowling, the one component that decided everything, was wrong. Dead wrong. Hold that thought, because what came next was not a smooth ascent to glory. It was a desperate scramble to fix a fatal flaw before the whole project was buried as just another promising failure. And now, to the heart of the problem, to the very engine that droned beneath the cowling of the first Mustangs. The early version fighters were fitted with the Allison 51710, 12 cylinders, liquid-cooled, power, around 1,100 horsepower. On paper, a solid, decent American engine, not outstanding, but not a failure either, a workhorse of its time. And here lies the promised inconsistency, the very one that hid for decades behind glowing articles about the best fighter of the war. This engine was good up to a certain altitude, and no further. Down low it was lively, eager, vicious. But the moment the machine climbed upward, into the thin air where the great aerial duels were actually decided, the Allison began to choke. The power dropped. The vigor melted away. The Predator turned into an ordinary, unremarkable machine. This comes down to a hidden flaw that people do not like to mention out loud. The engine had only a single supercharger setting, tuned for low altitudes. The higher it went, the worse it got. And by that time, the air war was already climbing higher and higher, up beneath the clouds, to the very levels where the first-generation Mustang was, in essence, powerless. Take in this paradox. A machine with a brilliant wing, with the cleanest aerodynamics, with a name destined to thunder, and at the same time, with an engine that locked it down near the ground like a falcon on a short leash. Deliveries of these aircraft to the Royal Air Force began in the autumn of 1941, not with fanfare, not as the arrival of a miracle, but quietly, as a reinforcement to a fighting fleet. And in the spring of 1942, the first-generation Mustangs were already being put to active use in the European theater of operations. And here the whole truth about their character came out. The British quickly figured out what the new machine was good for. In high-altitude clashes with the enemy, where you had to climb and fight beneath the clouds, there was little use for it. But down at ground level, the Mustang showed itself a beast. They threw it into reconnaissance, into ground attack, into flights over the very treetops, where speed and stability mattered more than ceiling. This comes down to the bitter irony of the whole story. An aircraft born to be king of the sky was, at first, driven to crawl along the ground, not because it was bad, but because its heart could not reach as high as its wings. And again, the uncomfortable question, straight to the face, how could this be? The best fighter of the war, and it began its path as a second-rate low-altitude laborer, a legend of a machine, cast in the role of a harness horse, not trusted with the main race. That is exactly how it was. And it is exactly this truth that gets quietly scrubbed from the glossy chronicles. The first Mustang was no champion. It was the rough blank of a champion, fitted with someone else's unsuitable heart. The British received a beautiful, fast but crippled machine, a magnificent airframe, and an engine from another league entirely. A union of genius and mediocrity beneath a single skin. And this rift could not be tolerated forever. Either the aircraft would remain a low altitude also ran forever, forgotten within a couple of years, or someone would take the risk and tear that weak heart out to put another in its place. That resolution was already drawing near, but before it could arrive, the world first had to see clearly just how painfully short the early Mustang fell of its own legend. Look closely at what the Royal Air Force actually did with their prize. They did not send these Mustangs up to escort the heavy bombers. They did not pit them against the enemy's high flyers in the duels that decided the fate of cities. No, they bent the machine down toward the dirt and the hedgerows. Armed reconnaissance, tactical sweeps, snapping photographs over enemy lines while skimming the fields at breakneck speed. It worked. Brilliantly, even at that altitude. But think about what it means. The fighter that history would crown as the finest of the war spent its first chapter doing the job of a courier and a spy, kept deliberately away from the heights where champions are made. And the cause was always the same. That single-stage Allison, a motor that gasped above 12 to 15,000 feet and surrendered the high ground to the enemy without a fight. You could polish the airframe, sharpen the wing, tune every rivet, and still the machine hit an invisible ceiling, a wall of thin air it simply could not punch through. This is the part the legend conveniently forgets. For its first year of war, the Mustang was a half-finished weapon, a body sculpted for greatness, shackled to a heart that belonged on a different, lesser plane. The potential was screaming to be released. The means to release it had not yet been found. And somewhere, far from the front, an engineer's eye was about to fall on that same airframe, and on a very different engine sitting quietly on another nation's workbench. The collision of those two ideas would change the air war forever. But that thunder still lay ahead. And while the British flogged their crippled trophy over the fields of Europe, across the ocean, an entirely different set of men had begun to take notice of this machine. And here, the story stops being British. It becomes American. It all started with something small. The United States military flew just 2 production machines, 2 Mustangs, no more. And that was enough. The American pilots climbed out of the cockpits, stunned. The flying qualities of the new machine astonished them. The obedience to the controls, the behavior in the air, the behavior at speed, everything pointed to one thing. This was no ordinary aircraft. This was something you could not simply walk past. This comes down to the first alarm bell for those who regarded the Mustang as a purely British plaything. A machine born of a British order, on British money, for British skies, was suddenly being eyed with interest from across the ocean, and that interest would very soon turn into a grip. So why, then, did the American Army not seize this aircraft at once? Why did it not line up for the very machine that had delighted its own pilots? The answer is simple and cynical. Budget. Money. The accounting of war. The United States Army already had its favorites, its contracts, its factories crammed with orders for other fighters. There was simply no spare cash for yet another machine, however superb. The Mustang was somebody else's child, and it was kept at arm's length. And then came the event that overturned everything. The 7th of December, 1941. Pearl Harbor, a sudden strike against the Pacific base of the United States. One day, and a country that only yesterday had watched the war from the sidelines was dragged into it whole, all at once. This comes down to the turning point after which all the old calculations went straight into the wastebasket. Yesterday's thrift became a luxury that could no longer be afforded. The country urgently needed combat aircraft. All of them, any of them, immediately. And so the government of the United States made a hard, almost unceremonious move. An order was issued to requisition part of the foreign arms contracts being produced on American factory floors. Machines built for the Allies, for foreign air forces along the supply lines, were now taken into its own possession. Take that in. Aircraft promised to one party were, by the right of wartime, handed over to another. And into this net fell the Mustangs. A few dozen machines from the British order changed owners overnight. They were simply taken. And now, pay attention, the key detail on which half of all the confusion around this machine rests. It was from this moment that the aircraft officially received its American designation. P-51, a dry index, a cold Army marking, no romance whatsoever. And the name? The name stayed British, Mustang. The biting nickname from the foggy Isle stuck fast and outlived everything, every index, every rebuild, every decade. P-51 for the paperwork, Mustang for the legend. This comes down to one of the rarest cases in the history of technology. The machine was conceived by some, named by others, and made famous by yet a third party. A British order, a British name, an American flag, an explosive mixture that spawned the future king of the sky. But it did not end with the requisitioned machines. Appetite comes with eating. In addition to the seized Mustangs, the United States Air Forces placed a new order, 500 more machines, built on the basis of that same P-51. And here hides one of the most curious and almost forgotten pages of all. These 500 machines were not ordered as pure fighters at all. They were pressed into service in an entirely different role. The updated Mustang proved magnificent as a dive bomber. A machine born for aerial combat came crashing down on targets from on high, precise, near vertical, inescapable. This variant was even given its own separate designation, the A-36. An aircraft with dive brakes, able to fall upon the enemy almost vertically and strike with deadly certainty. And again, the uncomfortable question: how did it come to this? The best machine of the war, as it would later be called, and at first it is bent into a scout, a ground attacker, a dive bomber. Why was it stubbornly used everywhere except where it was destined to become a legend, in the great high-altitude air battle? The answer is the same as ever. The same engine, feeble at altitude. The same unsuitable heart. The Americans, like the British before them, had received a magnificent airframe and did not yet know what to do with that treasure up high. But now the machine had something new. No longer one customer, but two. No longer one country, but two great powers, both clutching at the very same aircraft. A British flag and an American flag over a single design. The stakes had risen, the field of players had widened, and the fate of the Mustang no longer hung on a single warring empire alone. The machine was gaining weight. The orders were multiplying. The name was spreading on both sides of the ocean. Everything was ready for the decisive turn. Only one thing was still missing. That very replacement that would transform a sturdy, low-altitude laborer into the undisputed master of the sky. And that turn was already at the door, and linger for a moment on the sheer audacity of that requisition. A nation reached onto its own factory floor and lifted weapons clean out of another country's contract. Aircraft already paid for, already promised, already counted on by an ally fighting for its life. Wartime law made it legal, but the cold nerve of it tells you everything about how desperate the moment had become. The Mustang had gone, in a single stroke of the pen, from foreign curiosity to American property. 2 flags, 2 contracts, 1 airframe that neither side had yet learned to unleash. That was the strange, lopsided picture on the eve of the breakthrough. A future legend passed from hand to hand, prized by everyone, understood by no one. The engineers of North American were not sitting on their hands. While the machine was being flogged down at ground level, a quiet, stubborn effort was underway in the design halls. The aircraft was being refined, polished. They were searching for that one missing piece that would unlock the imprisoned potential. And at the start of 1943, new modifications stepped onto the stage. The first was the Mustang P-51A. It was fitted with the very same Allison V1710 engine, but now in a more powerful form. The machine became meaner, livelier, more dangerous down low. But, and this is the crucial part, the disease remained the same. That engine still feared altitude. This comes down to the very wall the brilliant airframe kept slamming into, time after time. No matter how much you tuned the Allison, the ceiling stayed insurmountable. A low-altitude motor cannot be turned into a high-altitude one with a simple twist of the wrench. What was needed was not a refinement. What was needed was a transplant of the heart. And here the British stepped back into the game, the very people who had been the first to believe in this machine. Their engineers did what the Americans had not yet gotten around to. They asked the audacious question, what if you tore out the feeble Allison and grafted an entirely different heart into this flawless airframe? The name of that heart, Rolls-Royce Merlin. Take in the sheer beauty of the move. The finest British aero engine, the very one that lifted the legendary Spitfires into the sky, is taken and mounted onto an American airframe with a laminar flow wing, an engine with a two-stage supercharger, a motor for which altitude was not an enemy but a native element, a British heart in an American body. This comes down to the most explosive union in the entire history of world aviation. Brilliant aerodynamics met worthy power, and what was born of that union surpassed the boldest expectations. So appeared the modifications Mustang P-51B and P-51C. No longer with the temperamental Allison, but with that Merlin heart. On the production machines it was built under license in American factories. The same engine, two countries. One result, a machine that had no equal at altitude. And now, the figures. The very figures that take your breath away. Because the results did not merely improve, they detonated. Rate of climb, how fast the machine gains altitude in combat, a parameter that decides life and the loss of life in an aerial clash. Well then, the rate of climb rose by nearly double, not by percentages, not by a touch, by almost 2 times over. Ceiling, the very altitude above which the old Mustang simply could not haul itself. The service ceiling leapt by roughly 3,000 meters. The machine seemed to be let off a short leash, and it bolted upward into those very levels that had once been sealed shut against it. Speed. The top speed in level flight rose by various estimates by almost 80 kilometers per hour. The same airframe, the same wing, the same contours, but a different heart, and the machine seemed reborn. This comes down to one of the rarest miracles in engineering. Usually a gain in one characteristic is paid for by the collapse of another. You want speed, you lose maneuverability. You want ceiling, you sacrifice acceleration. But here everything shot upward at once. Climb, ceiling, speed, 3 parameters in a row, and every one of them soared. Yesterday's low-altitude laborer, driven over the treetops, had suddenly turned into a high-altitude predator, into a machine able to fight where it once choked to the point of ruin, beneath the clouds, at great height, in the very heart of the real air war. And again, the uncomfortable question, straight to the face. Why was this obvious move not made at once? Why did the brilliant airframe haul an unsuitable engine for almost 2 years before someone thought of the swap? How many battles were lost, how many chances squandered, only because a great machine was stubbornly kept with someone else's feeble heart? History modestly stays silent, but the figures speak loudly. And those figures announced to the world the project that had nearly been written off as a mediocrity had just turned into a contender for the throne. But this was not yet the finale. This was only the run-up. Because ahead, North American was preparing a version beside which even the transformed B and C models would look like a rough draft, a version whose name the whole world would come to know, a version that would claim the title of the best. And it was precisely the arrival of that version that would overturn the balance in the sky for good. But let us not skate past what this transplant truly meant, because the textbooks always do. This was not a tweak. It was not an upgrade in the modern marketing sense of the word. It was the rarest thing in all of engineering. A machine that was good at one altitude becoming lethal at every altitude overnight by the grace of a single foreign component. Think about the absurdity buried in that. The American airframe, the cleanest, most advanced shape in the sky. The British engine, the most refined high-altitude motor of the age. For nearly 2 years, these two perfect halves existed on the same planet, in the same war, on the same side, and nobody bolted them together. Two allies, two workshops, one obvious answer sitting in plain sight, and it took until the 3rd year of the war for someone to finally connect the dots. Why? Pride, perhaps. Bureaucracy, certainly. The endless, grinding inertia of armies that had already chosen their favorites and signed their contracts. Whatever the reason, the delay is staggering. An entire fleet of crippled thoroughbreds flew, fought, and were lost at low altitude, while the cure sat on a workbench in another country. And when the cure was finally applied, the transformation was so total that it bordered on the suspicious. How does a second-rate scout become a world-beating fighter by swapping one box of metal for another? How does a single engine add 3,000 meters of ceiling, half again as much climb, and the better part of 80 kilometers an hour, all at once, with no penalty anywhere? The answer is that the airframe had always been a champion. It had simply been chained to the wrong heart. Free it, and the truth came roaring out. The Merlin did not improve the Mustang. The Merlin revealed it, and so the stage was set. The legend had its body. The legend had its heart. All that remained was the final form, the version that would take everything learned, everything fixed, everything perfected, and weld it into the single most famous fighter the world would ever know. But true glory, the kind that was worldwide and deafening, was brought to North America not by the B model nor the C. It was brought by the next modification, the one this whole account was built around. The Mustang P-51D, the machine that, even today, is called the classic, the benchmark, the face of the legend. And the first thing that struck the eye, you could see it from far away, in the most literal sense. Outwardly, the new Mustang differed sharply from all its predecessors. The chief innovation, a frameless teardrop canopy over the cockpit. A single transparent dome with no bars or struts blocking the view. For the first time, the pilot received a full all-around field of vision. He could see everything. The sky above his head, the space behind his back, that very rear hemisphere from which, in air combat, trouble most often came. This comes down to a detail that, on the ground, looks like a trifle, and in the sky decided who would return to base and who would not. Before, the pilot turned his head and ran his gaze straight into metal. Now, clear glass on every side. The Predator had finally been given eyes in the back of its head. But that was not all. The very appearance of the machine had changed. The updated Mustangs were no longer painted. Take in the audacity of that decision. A world war is raging, and combat aircraft roll off the line bare, gleaming with polished metal like a mirror. No camouflage, no concealment, defiantly, almost provocatively bright. Why? Because by that time the balance in the sky had changed for good. Dominance of the air had already been won. There was no longer anyone to hide from. Camouflage was deemed a needless burden. Extra weight, extra labor, extra paint. Why hide a machine that had itself come out hunting? This comes down to a rare gesture of pure supremacy in all of history. Polished metal instead of camouflage is not carelessness. It is a statement. It is something said without words. We no longer hide. We are the masters of this sky. Only one part was coated in dark matte paint, the top of the nose, from the cockpit to the very propeller. And not for the sake of concealment. For the sake of the pilot's eyes, to kill the blinding sun glare bouncing off the gleaming metal right in front of his face. cold calculation, even in the smallest things. But the main thing, as always, was hidden not on the outside. The main thing droned beneath the cowling. The P-51D received the Packard 5.1650-7 engine. That same licensed Merlin, born of British genius and set onto an American assembly line. But this was no longer a mere transplant of the heart. This was a heart with a special, hidden potential. And here, the closing of the whole technical intrigue. This motor had something tucked away that the earlier versions did not. Special operating modes, concealed reserves of power, which the pilot could unleash at the decisive instant. In ordinary flight, one level of power, calm, economical, workmanlike. But the moment the throttle was pushed to combat setting, the engine seemed to break off its chain. The power leapt to roughly 1,500 horsepower. The machine swelled with a vicious, taut strength, and for the most extreme case, one more trump card was kept in reserve. The emergency mode, an emergency power that was allowed to be held for no more than 5 minutes, because any longer, and the motor simply would not endure the strain. And in that mode the engine delivered its absolute limit, more than 1,700 horsepower. Take in what that meant in real combat. 5 minutes of absolute fury, 5 minutes in which the machine wrung out of itself every last drop. Those minutes were enough to catch up, to shake off a pursuer, to turn around a fight that had seemed already lost. And this, the rising staircase of power, from calm cruiser to 5-minute beast, is what carried the aircraft into the ranks of the very best fighters of the Second World War. Notice how the circle closed. A machine begun as a simple copy of someone else's Tomahawk. A machine kept down at ground level with someone else's feeble motor. A machine driven into reconnaissance, then into the dive bomber role. That very machine now stood at the summit, gleaming, sighted, with a reserve of hidden fury beneath the cowling. And again, the uncomfortable question. How many years, how many versions, how many trials and errors did it take to finally assemble the thing that had been begging to exist almost from the very start? A brilliant airframe, a worthy heart, full visibility, a hidden reserve of might. Separately, all of it had existed for a long time. Together, only now. What stood before the world was not merely a good fighter. What stood before the world was a predator in perfect form. The very Mustang that had been promised at the very beginning. The one whose name was now spoken with respect and with dread on both sides of the front. The rough draft of the legend had at last become the legend itself, but the story did not end there. Because true triumph always has its figures, and those figures would prove louder still than everything that had come before. But pause on that bare metal finish a little longer, because it hides a confession the proud chronicles rarely spell out. For years, every warplane on every side wore camouflage for one simple reason: fear. Fear of being spotted, fear of being caught on the ground, fear of the hunter overhead. To strip that paint away was to renounce fear itself. It was a nation declaring, in polished aluminum, that it no longer expected to be the prey. And think about what that says about the machine wearing it. The Mustang was not painted bright because someone was careless. It was painted bright because, by then, the enemy could see it coming and still do nothing about it. Visibility was no longer a weakness. It had become a taunt. Now layer onto that the canopy, the all-around view. In the brutal arithmetic of a dogfight, the pilot who sees first fires first. The pilot who is blind behind him is already half finished. For years, the Mustang's predecessors, and most of their rivals, flew with a wall of metal at the pilot's shoulders, a blind spot wide enough to swallow an entire attacking flight. The teardrop canopy erased that blind spot in a single stroke. It did not just look modern. It rewrote the odds of survival. And then, the hidden power. Understand what an emergency mode truly is. It is permission to damage your own engine in exchange for your own life. Push the throttle past the gate, and the Merlin would scream out more than 1,700 horsepower, knowing full well that every second at that setting was eating into the motor's life. 5 minutes. No more. A countdown to self-destruction, traded for a countdown to victory. That is the cold genius buried in the P-51D. Vision the enemy did not have. Confidence the enemy could no longer afford. And a sealed envelope of raw power to be torn open only when everything was on the line. Put it all together, and you no longer have an aircraft. You have a verdict, delivered on the very best fighter of the war, begun as a copy, crowned as a king, and not one rivet of it left to chance. The Mustang P-51D modification became the most mass-produced of them all, and here the figures step in, the kind that put a heavy full stop on any argument about this machine's greatness. Around 8,000 fighters of this version rolled off the assembly line. 8,000. Take in that number. A machine that had begun as the doubtful gamble of a firm without a single fighter to its name was now being stamped out by the thousand, wave after wave, as if the war itself were working to glorify it. This comes down to the most eloquent proof there can ever be in engineering. Bad machines are not built by the thousand. Useless aircraft are not put into mass production. 8,000 units is a verdict handed down by history in the Mustang's favor, final and not subject to appeal. But even that is not the whole picture. Trace the geography. Trace where this machine spread. Part of them, around 280, went by lend-lease back to Britain, to the very people who had once ordered a nameless prototype and were the first to believe in the audacious idea. The circle had closed. A machine born of a British order returned to the British, no longer as a rough draft, but as an absolute champion. Another 100 or so went to Australia, and the lion's share remained with the air forces of the United States, in the hands of that very army that had once waved away a foreign fighter for lack of money. Now this foreign aircraft had become its chief pride. This comes down to one of the sharpest mockeries of fate in all the history of aviation. The machine was not wanted. The machine was kept down at ground level. The machine was offered up as a scout, a dive bomber, and it went and outgrew them all, both those who ordered it and those who first rejected it. Its title as the best fighter in the world was no longer disputed by anyone, and the reason was not the dry specifications alone. In the hands of a skilled pilot, the Mustang could do things in the sky that were simply beyond any other aircraft of that era. The range over which it escorted heavy bombers deep into enemy territory, the speed with which it slipped out of any trap, the turn, the roll, the dive, all at the limit, all beyond the possible for its rivals. This was not merely a machine of war. It was the benchmark by which all the others were now measured. And here, the most astonishing part. Legends usually live brightly, but briefly. They flare and they fade. They give way to the new. But not this predator. The war ended, and the Mustang had no intention of leaving the stage. In the United States National Guard, these fighters carried on in service right up to the middle of the 1950s. The age of the jet was already arriving. Aircraft of an entirely different generation were already rising into the sky, and yet the piston-engined Mustang still stood in the ranks, stubbornly, proudly, like a living monument to itself. And even that was not the limit. A small number of these machines remained in service for roughly another 20 years. 20 years after the war. An aircraft born of the desperate gamble of 1940 outlived the very era that had created it. Take in the sheer scale of that span. From a cramped office of the British Purchasing Commission to polished squadrons dominating the sky. From a feeble motor gasping at altitude to a 5-minute beast tearing through space. From a nameless rough draft to a name still spoken today in a reverent hush. And again, the last uncomfortable question. How many more such stories lie hidden in the dry lines of the official chronicles? How many legends began with a refusal, with a risk, with an audacity that was later quietly combed flat and forgotten? The Mustang traveled that entire road, from a foreign copy no one was waiting for, to the undisputed king of the sky whom no one could any longer dethrone. A machine that was never supposed to be built. A machine nearly buried twice. A machine that became the best in spite of everything. And that is precisely why, decades later, its silhouette, gleaming metal, teardrop canopy, predatory profile, still remains one of the most recognizable symbols of an entire era. An era when the sky belonged to those who dared to do the impossible. But let us drag one more truth into the light, the one that mattered most, and the one the tidy summaries love to bury under a list of statistics. The greatest thing the Mustang ever did was not a number of kills or a top speed. It was a single, war-altering capability. It could go all the way to the enemy's heartland, and all the way back, glued to the bombers it was sworn to protect. Before this machine, the heavy bombers flew into the deep enemy sky almost alone. Their short-legged escorts turned back at the border, and from that line onward, the bombers were on their own, hunted, harried, paying a brutal price over every target. The math was merciless. Send the bombers far, and you sent them to be torn apart. Keep them close, and you struck nothing that mattered. The Mustang erased that cruel equation. With its clean wing and its thirsty efficiency, it carried fuel enough to follow the bombers to the farthest targets and stand guard the entire way. And waiting up there, at the heights where the old Mustang had once choked and surrendered, this version arrived with power to spare. The hunters who had once feasted on undefended bombers suddenly found a polished predator riding shotgun. The skies that had been a slaughter pen for the heavy crews became, almost overnight, a trap for those who attacked them. That is the part that turns a fast fighter into a war winner. Not the gleam of the metal, not the figures on a spec sheet. The simple, staggering fact that it changed what was possible, that it walked into airspace that had been forbidden and made it home. And here lies the deepest irony of all. The aircraft that achieved this was not the clean product of a single master plan. It was a hybrid, an American body, a British heart, an idea cobbled together across an ocean by two nations that, for nearly 2 years, had failed to see what they were holding. The best fighter of the war was, in truth, an accident of genius, assembled almost in spite of the men who built it. So when you see that silhouette today, at an air show, in a faded photograph, in the slow roll of a restored warbird across a summer sky, understand what you are looking at. Not just a beautiful machine, a monument to a refusal. To the day a firm that had never built a fighter looked at an order to copy someone else's work and said quietly, "No, we will build our own." They were never supposed to win. And they did not merely win. They built the standard by which winning itself would be measured for generations to come. That is the real story of the Mustang, not the legend the chronicles polished smooth, but the rougher, stranger, far more astonishing truth underneath it. 8,000 of the classic version, hundreds shipped across the world, a service life that outran the war by 2 decades and shrugged off the dawn of the jet. No machine earns that kind of endurance by accident. It earns it by being, quite simply, better than everything sent up to beat it, and by refusing again and again to be anything less than the best. And now, the central question this video leaves wide open. The best fighter of the Second World War was born as someone else's copy. A British airframe was denied a British engine for nearly 2 years. A brilliant machine crawled along the ground until someone finally thought of one simple swap. And to this day, people argue, was the Mustang truly the best? Or was its legend merely polished brighter than its rivals? So what do you think? Who deserves the title of the finest fighter of that war? The American Mustang, the British Spitfire, or someone whose name was unfairly pushed into the shadows? And above all, did the Mustang become great because of the American airframe or the British heart? Write your verdicts in the comments, and do not be afraid to argue. Leave a like if you want more of the uncomfortable truth about machines that were served to us smoothed over for decades. Subscribe and switch on the bell to be the first to reach the archives where every legend has a second, far more audacious side. Because the most fascinating part about the skies of that era, we have not even begun to tell.